Picture this. Through a broken window, your flashlight illuminates a grand ballroom where gold leaf peels from 30-foot ceilings like dying skin. Crystal chandeliers hang at dangerous angles. Water cascades down a marble staircase that once welcomed the Astors and Vanderbilts. This is Lynnewood Hall today. 110 rooms of rotting grandeur. America's Versailles turned into Instagram's favorite corpse. But this isn't just another abandoned mansion story. This is about how the Titanic disaster, a father's grief, and ultimately our modern obsession with ruin porn destroyed what was once the crown jewel of American architecture. If you enjoy long-form documentaries about America's forgotten palaces, consider subscribing. It really helps. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Lynnewood Hall should be saved, or has it gone too far? To understand this tragedy, we need to go back 127 years, to a time when streetcars were revolutionizing cities and one butcher's son was about to build an empire that would rival the Vanderbilts. Philadelphia, 1834. Peter Errol Brown Widener entered the world not in a mansion, but above a butcher shop in the working-class neighborhood of Fishtown. His father slaughtered livestock. His mother kept the books. Young Peter learned early that meat was money, but he had grander ambitions than blood and bone. By 14, he was working in his older brother's butcher shop. But Peter saw something others missed. The Civil War was coming, and armies need to eat. When conflict erupted in 1861, the 27-year-old Widener secured a contract to supply mutton to the Union Army. It was a simple equation: thousands of soldiers, 3 meals a day, 4 years of war. By Appomattox, Peter Widener had transformed from butcher to businessman, with a fortune approaching $1 million. But meat was just the beginning. The real money, Widener realized, wasn't in what people ate, it was in how they moved. Philadelphia in the 1870s was exploding outward, and citizens needed transportation. Horse-drawn omnibuses were slow, expensive, inefficient. The solution was obvious to those with vision: streetcars, metal rails, electric power, a monopoly on movement. Widener partnered with William Elkins, his neighbor in North Philadelphia. Where others saw competitors, these two men saw opportunity for collaboration. They began buying up small streetcar lines, first 1, then 5, then 20. By 1883, they controlled the Philadelphia Traction Company, the largest streetcar syndicate in America. The newspapers called them the Traction Kings. Let that sink in for a moment. Two men essentially controlled how an entire city moved. Streetcars made Widener rich. What came next made him legendary. In 1901, J.P. Morgan was assembling the largest corporation the world had ever seen, United States Steel. He needed investors with deep pockets and iron nerves. Widener was both. His investment of $10 million returned a profit of $100 million. A tenfold increase in less than 18 months. Think about that scale. In today's dollars, that's roughly $3 billion of profit from a single investment. But Widener wasn't done. He joined the board of American Tobacco. He invested in Standard Oil through his son, Joseph. He built streetcar systems in Chicago, Pittsburgh, Baltimore. By 1895, his fortune exceeded $50 million, making him one of the 20 richest men in America. The Wideners lived well, but not ostentatiously. Their Broad Street mansion in Philadelphia was large but not palatial. They summered in Newport but didn't build a cottage. Peter Widener seemed content with comfort rather than display. Then came 1893, and everything changed. That year, Widener attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He walked through the White City, those temporary palaces of plaster and dreams, and saw what American architecture could be. He stood in the shadow of buildings that looked permanent, eternal, European. Buildings that announced their owners as more than rich. They announced them as important. Widener returned to Philadelphia with a vision. He would build something that would outlast the temporary grandeur of Chicago's fair. Something real. Something in stone. The location came first. Elkins Park, 14 miles northwest of Philadelphia's center. Close enough to maintain business interests, far enough to escape the city's grime and crime. Widener already owned land there, a country estate called Ogontz, where the family spent summers. But Ogontz was merely comfortable. What Widener envisioned required space for something unprecedented. He began buying adjacent properties, farm by farm, acre by acre. Eventually, he assembled 480 acres of rolling hills, mature trees, and pristine streams. This wasn't just land for a house. This was land for an estate that would rival the country houses of European nobility. The architect came next. Horace Trumbauer was an unlikely choice. Just 28 years old, self-taught, never attended university. The Philadelphia establishment dismissed him as an upstart. But Widener saw something others missed: hunger. Trumbauer wanted to build monuments, not houses. He studied Versailles, Blenheim, Chatsworth. He understood that true grandeur required scale, symmetry, and an almost aggressive perfection. Their first meeting lasted 4 hours. Widener spread maps across his library table. Trumbauer sketched. By the end, they had agreed on something unprecedented in American domestic architecture. A 110-room palace in the Georgian style, but grander than anything built in the Georgian era. The budget? "Build it right," Widener said. "I'll worry about the cost." Those 6 words would result in the most expensive private residence ever constructed in America up to that point. $8 million in 1897 money. In today's currency, that's approximately $300 million. But here's what those numbers don't tell you. This wasn't just about display. Widener was 63 years old. He had watched the Vanderbilts build their Fifth Avenue chateaus. He had visited Morgan's Madison Avenue Palace. He had dined at Frick's Pittsburgh Monument to steal money. Each mansion told a story. The Vanderbilts built French castles to claim European sophistication. Morgan built a Renaissance palace to showcase his art. Frick built a fortress to protect himself from the workers he had brutalized. Widener would build something different. Not a castle, not a fortress, not a museum. He would build the largest Georgian mansion in the world, a style that whispered rather than shouted, that emphasized proportion over decoration, that suggested its owner possessed not just wealth, but taste. Construction began in fall 1897. 300 workers descended on Elkins Park. The foundation alone took 6 months. They dug down 30 feet to reach bedrock. The basement would be larger than most mansions. But as workers laid the foundation stones, Widener would sometimes stand at the construction site in the evening light, watching the sun set over what would become his legacy. His wife, Hannah, had been diagnosed with a chronic illness. His son, George, was showing more interest in books than business. His younger son, Joseph, preferred horses to art. The house rising from the ground wasn't just a monument to success. It was an attempt to build something permanent in a world where Widener was beginning to realize nothing truly was. The walls began to rise in spring 1898. Indiana limestone, so white it seemed to glow in moonlight. Steel I-beams, a new technology that allowed for larger rooms, higher ceilings, more windows than stone alone could support. The house would be fireproof, Trumbauer promised. It would last 500 years. By winter, the exterior was complete. From the road, hidden behind new planted trees that would take decades to mature, you could glimpse something impossible. A perfect Georgian mansion, balanced and symmetrical, but at a scale that defied comprehension. 110 rooms. Let that sink in. Spring 1899. The exterior stood complete, but inside, Lynnewood Hall was still a skeleton of steel and stone. Now came the real work. Joseph Duveen arrived from London with a team of 20 craftsmen. Duveen was the world's most expensive interior decorator, the man who had furnished palaces for the Rothschilds and Romanovs. His bill would exceed $2 million, a quarter of the construction budget, for the interior alone. The entrance hall set the tone. 40 feet wide, 60 feet long, with a ceiling that rose 3 full stories. The walls were Ken stone, imported from the same French quarries that built the castles of Normandy. Each block was numbered in France, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled like a 3-dimensional puzzle. But it was the details that stunned. The main staircase used 3 types of marble: white Carrara for the steps, green Verde Antique for the balusters, black Portoro for the base. Each baluster was carved by hand from a single block of stone. The process took 1 craftsman 1 week per baluster. There were 236 balusters. That's 4.5 years of labor for a single staircase. The dining room could seat 100. The table, when fully extended, stretched 60 feet, so long that footmen needed a wheeled cart to serve from one end to the other. The ceiling was painted with clouds and cherubs by Vittorio Matteo Corcos, who spent 3 months on his back on scaffolding, recreating techniques Michelangelo used in the Sistine Chapel. The ballroom occupied the entire western wing, 10,000 square feet, larger than most houses. The ceiling, covered in gold leaf, required 6 men working for 4 months to complete. The gold alone cost $30,000. The 3 chandeliers, custom-made by Baccarat in France, each contained 2,000 crystals. They weighed a ton apiece and required special steel reinforcements in the ceiling to support them. E.F. Caldwell, the premier American lighting firm, created 236 custom light fixtures for the house. Each was unique, designed specifically for its room, cast in bronze, plated in gold, wired for both electricity and gas, because Widener didn't trust the new technology completely. The art gallery wing stretched 150 feet along the eastern side. Duveen designed it like a European museum: skylights for natural illumination, silk-covered walls to protect paintings, a climate control system using steam radiators and fresh air vents to maintain constant temperature and humidity. This wasn't just ostentation. Widener had been collecting art for 20 years, and his collection required space. 14 Rembrandts, 3 Raphaels, works by Van Dyck, Reynolds, Gainsborough, Turner, Chinese porcelains from the Ming and Qing dynasties, Gobelin tapestries that once hung in Versailles. But Lynnewood Hall was more than an art gallery with bedrooms. It was a machine designed for a very specific kind of life. 55 bedrooms, because a proper house party required at least 30 guests, each with their own lady's maid or valet. 20 bathrooms, each with both hot and cold running water, a luxury most hotels couldn't offer. The Turkish bath in the basement, lined with tiles from Istanbul, where the temperature could reach 140 degrees. The kitchen occupied 3,000 square feet, 3 separate cooking areas, one for meat, one for pastries, one for vegetables. A cold room for storing ice, delivered daily from Widener's own ice house on the property. A bakery that could produce 200 loaves of bread per day. A wine cellar with racks for 20,000 bottles, maintained at exactly 55 degrees year-round. The servants' wing housed 70 full-time staff: butler, under-butler, footman, parlour-maids, chambermaids, kitchen-maids, scullery-maids. A French chef recruited from Delmonico's in New York. A head gardener from Kew Gardens in London. Each servant had their own room, small but private, another luxury in an era when most domestic staff slept in shared quarters. The technology was cutting edge for 1899. Central heating through steam radiators. Electric lights throughout with a backup gas system. An internal telephone system with 42 extensions. An Otis elevator, the first installed in a private residence in Pennsylvania. A power plant on the grounds that could run independently from the city grid. Think about the ambition of that. Widener built a house that was its own city. The opening gala was scheduled for December 19, 1899. Not coincidentally, this was Widener's 65th birthday. The preparations began 3 months in advance. Jacques Grébert, the French landscape architect, supervised the planting of 10,000 tulip bulbs imported from Holland. They would bloom in spring, but for the winter opening he created elaborate greenhouse displays, orange trees, palms, orchids, arranged throughout the public rooms. The guest list read like a social register. Vanderbilts, Astors, Morgans, Drexels, the governor of Pennsylvania, senators, congressmen, diplomats, the Cardinal of Philadelphia. 800 invitations sent, 600 acceptances received. The menu, preserved in the Widener papers, reveals the scale of excess. Oysters from Chesapeake Bay, terrapin soup, lobster Newburgh, fillet of beef with truffle sauce, roast pheasant with chestnut stuffing, Roman punch to cleanse the palate, asparagus with hollandaise, in December, meaning it was grown in Widener's own greenhouses, charlotte russe, petit four, fruits and nuts. 14 courses, 7 wines. The meal lasted 4 hours. But the moment everyone remembered came at midnight. Widener stood at the top of the grand staircase and raised a champagne glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "welcome to Lynnewood Hall." The name itself was significant. Lynnewood, combining the linden trees that lined the entrance drive with the English tradition of naming estates after their natural features. Hall, not mansion, not palace, not court. Hall suggested something ancient, established, permanent. Harry Widener, Widener's grandson, just 14 years old, later wrote in his diary about that night. "Grandfather stood there like a king in his castle, but I noticed grandmother's chair was empty. She was too ill to come downstairs. I think that's when I realized all the gold in the world couldn't buy what really mattered. The party continued until 4 a.m. Carriages lined up for a quarter-mile down Spring Avenue. The Philadelphia Inquirer called it the most magnificent private entertainment ever given in Pennsylvania. But even as guests danced in the ballroom, signs of what was to come were visible to those who looked closely. George Widener, Peter's eldest son and heir, spent most of the evening in the library, more interested in his collection of rare books than in entertaining. His wife, Eleanor, seemed distracted, anxious. She had been reading about the new ocean liners being built in Belfast, floating palaces that would make even Lynnewood Hall seem modest by comparison. By 1905, Lynnewood Hall had settled into its rhythm. The day began at 5 a.m. when the kitchen staff started preparing breakfast. By 6 a.m., gardeners were at work in the greenhouses. By 7 a.m., housemaids were cleaning the public rooms, a task that took 12 women 4 hours to complete. The family breakfasted at 9 a.m. in the morning room, never the grand dining room, which was reserved for dinners of 12 or more. Peter Widener's routine never varied. Breakfast, then 2 hours in his study, managing his empire by telephone and telegram. A walk through the gardens with the head gardener, inspecting new plantings, planning improvements. Lunch, often alone, reading financial newspapers. Afternoons in the art gallery, sometimes with visitors, often by himself, studying his paintings with a magnifying glass, comparing them to photographs in art books, compiling notes for the catalogue he was writing. The catalogue became an obsession. Widener hired scholars from Harvard and Princeton to research provenance. He corresponded with museum directors in London, Paris, Berlin. Each painting received its own entry, not just artist and date, but complete ownership history, exhibition records, scholarly opinions. The final document, privately printed in 1915, ran to 400 pages. This wasn't a rich man's vanity project. Widener understood something crucial. Without documentation, art was just decoration. With it, art became history. Evenings brought visitors. Lynnewood Hall was open by appointment to serious students of art, 2 days per week. The guest book from these years, preserved at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, shows remarkable names. Bernard Berenson, the great art critic. Isabella Stewart Gardner, building her own museum in Boston. A young man named Andrew Mellon, taking notes that would influence his creation of the National Gallery decades later. But Lynnewood Hall was also a family home, and the Widener grandchildren left their own record of life in the palace. George and Eleanor Widener had 3 children, Harry, George Jr., and Eleanor. The children occupied an entire floor, with their own schoolroom, playroom, and governess quarters. Their lives were rigidly scheduled. Lessons from 9 to noon, lunch with the governess, afternoon activities, riding, tennis, swimming in the indoor pool, tea at 4, bed by 8. Harry, the eldest, was bookish like his father. By age 20, he had assembled his own collection of rare books, focusing on Robert Louis Stevenson first editions. His grandfather built him a private library within Lynnewood Hall, fireproof, climate-controlled, with exhibition cases for his most precious volumes. Young George Jr. preferred the stables to the library. The Lynnewood stables housed 40 horses, thoroughbreds for racing, hunters for fox hunting, matched pairs for carriages. George Jr. could identify each horse by its whinny, knew their bloodlines, their temperaments, their speeds. Eleanor, the only girl, left the most poignant record. Her diary, discovered in the estate papers, captures the strange isolation of extreme wealth. June 15th, 1911. Another party tonight. 200 guests. Wore the pink Worth gown from Paris. Danced with Tommy Drexel, who stepped on my feet. The orchestra played until 3. I watched from my window as the carriages left, their lights like fireflies disappearing into the dark. Sometimes I feel like we live in a beautiful prison. All these rooms, and nowhere to really be yourself. By 1911, Peter Widener's art collection was valued at $50 million, more than the house itself. The numbers are staggering. 14 Rembrandts, the largest private collection outside Europe. Van Dyck's portrait of Cardinal Bentivoglio, purchased for $400,000. Raphael's small Cooper Madonna, which London's National Gallery tried desperately to keep from leaving England. The Mazarin tapestries, woven for Cardinal Mazarin in the 1650s, which Widener bought from the French government. But it was a small Dutch portrait that Widener loved most. Rembrandt's The Mill, which hung in his private study. He would sit for hours studying it, the way the light fell on the windmill's sails, the subtle gradations of the threatening sky. Rembrandt understood, he told a visitor, that darkness makes the light more precious. The collection required constant attention. Temperature and humidity monitored hourly. Paintings regularly inspected for signs of deterioration. A full-time conservator employed to clean and repair. Insurance premiums that exceeded most people's annual salaries. And security. By 1911, Widener employed 6 private detectives who lived on the estate. Electric alarms on every window and door. A direct telephone line to the Elkins Park police station. A safe room hidden behind the library where the most valuable pieces could be moved in case of threat. The threats were real. In 1911 alone, there were 3 attempted break-ins. One man, claiming to be an art student, was discovered making detailed sketches of the house's layout. Another was caught testing windows after midnight. The third, most disturbingly, was a former servant who knew the house's routines. That autumn, something else occupied the family's attention. George and Eleanor Widener were planning a European trip. A buying expedition, George for his books, Eleanor for fashion, both for art. They would spend 3 months visiting dealers in London and Paris. For their return journey, they booked passage on a new ship, the RMS Titanic, on its maiden voyage, the largest moving object ever created by human hands. A ship so well designed, its builders claimed, that it was practically unsinkable. London, April 1912. George and Eleanor Widener had spent 3 successful months in Europe. George acquired a 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's Essays, one of only 3 known copies, for his Harvard friend, Harry Elkins Widener, his son, who shared his passion for rare books. Eleanor had ordered her winter wardrobe from Worth in Paris. Together, they had purchased 2 Renoir paintings and a Ming Dynasty vase that dated to 1368. The question was how to get home. The traditional choice would have been the Mauretania, Cunard's reliable liner. But White Star Line's new ship offered something irresistible, the chance to be part of history. The Titanic wasn't just the largest ship ever built, it was a floating Lynnewood Hall, a palace that moved. The first-class suites cost $4,350, roughly $130,000 in today's money for a 5-day voyage. George booked 2 suites, C80 for himself and Eleanor, C82 for Harry, who would join them in Paris. On April 9th, the family met for lunch at the Ritz in Paris. Harry showed his father his own prize, a rare 1598 second edition of Bacon's Essay that he'd found in a dusty London bookshop for £40. Father was so proud, Eleanor would later recall. He said Harry had a better eye for books than he did. They boarded at Cherbourg on April 10th. The Wideners knew half the first-class passenger list: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss. It was like a floating extension of Philadelphia society. April 14th was a Sunday. The Wideners attended divine service in the first-class dining room at 10:30 a.m. They lunched with the Carters. Harry spent the afternoon reading in the library. That evening, they hosted a dinner party in the à la carte restaurant to honour Captain Smith. Their guests included the Astors, the Carters, and Major Archibald Butt. The menu from that dinner survived in Eleanor's effects: oysters, salmon, filet mignon, pâté de foie gras, peaches in chartreuse jelly, coffee, cigars. The party broke up at 10:30 p.m. Captain Smith excused himself to return to the bridge. The Wideners retired to their suite. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout, Frederick Fleet, spotted an iceberg dead ahead. What happened next has been documented 1,000 times, but rarely from the Widener perspective. Eleanor was preparing for bed when she felt what she described as a slight jar, nothing more than if we docked rather hurriedly. George went to investigate. He returned 10 minutes later with a peculiar expression. "The captain suggests we dress warmly and come to the boat deck, as a precaution." The Wideners dressed quickly but properly. George in evening clothes, Eleanor in a fur coat over her dinner dress, Harry in his overcoat. They gathered Eleanor's jewellery case, but left everything else. The Bacon essays remained on Harry's nightstand. On the boat deck, the scene was surreal. The band was playing ragtime. Some passengers were playing with chunks of ice that had fallen from the berg. Many were complaining about being roused from warm beds for what seemed like a drill. But George Widener noticed what others missed. The ship had developed a slight list to starboard. The crew was uncovering the lifeboats with unusual urgency. And Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was moving along the deck with a face white as paper. At 12:25 a.m., the order came to load the boats with women and children. George helped Eleanor into Lifeboat 4. She resisted. "We've been through worse," she said. "The Widener luck will hold." "The Widener luck," George replied, "is why you're getting in that boat." Harry helped his mother with her fur coat. "I'll see you in New York," he said. "Father and I will catch another boat." Those were the last words Eleanor heard her son speak. Lifeboat 4 launched at 1:55 a.m. with 40 passengers in a boat designed for 65. Eleanor Widener watched the Titanic's lights from a distance of perhaps 200 yards. The ship was ablaze with light, she later testified. Every porthole, every window, like Lynnewood Hall on a party night. I kept looking for George and Harry among the figures on deck, but it was impossible to distinguish faces. At 2:20 a.m., the lights went out. Then came the sound like 1,000 pieces of china breaking all at once, Eleanor said. The Titanic broke in half and sank. The women in Lifeboat 4 wanted to go back to look for survivors. The crew refused. They'd be swamped by desperate swimmers. For the next 2 hours, they floated in darkness, listening to what Eleanor described as the most terrible sound I ever heard. Hundreds of voices calling for help, slowly fading to silence. The Carpathia arrived at dawn. Eleanor was hauled aboard in a bosun's chair. She spent the 3-day voyage to New York in the ship's hospital, sedated with laudanum, asking repeatedly for George and Harry. In Lynnewood Hall, Peter Widener received the first telegram on April 15th. Titanic sunk. Fate of passengers unknown. He collapsed immediately, suffering a stroke that paralyzed his left side. For 3 days he lay in his bed while his staff frantically sought information. Finally, on April 18th, a telegram from Eleanor. Safe. George and Harry lost. Home soon. When Eleanor finally returned to Lynnewood Hall on April 20th, she found the estate draped in black crepe. Every mirror was covered. Every clock had been stopped at 2:20 a.m., the moment the Titanic sank. Peter Widener, partially paralyzed, had ordered that George and Harry's rooms be sealed, preserved exactly as they'd left them. Eleanor entered the house she'd left 4 months earlier as a happy wife and mother. Now she was a widow whose son's body would never be recovered. The 110 rooms that had seemed palatial now felt like a mausoleum. She would spend the next 3 years building the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library at Harvard, the largest donation the university had ever received. Her conditions were specific. Harvard must serve ice cream at every meal, Harry's favorite, and require every student to pass a swimming test. Harry couldn't swim. But no monument could fill the absence. Lynnewood Hall had been built to establish a dynasty. The Titanic had ended it in a single night. Peter Widener lived 3 more years after the Titanic, but he was never the same. The stroke had taken his mobility, but not his mind. He spent his days in a wheelchair in the art gallery, being pushed slowly past his Rembrandts and Raphaels. "All this beauty," he told a friend, "and I would trade every painting for 1 more day with my son." The house continued to function. Dinners were served, guests received, the gardens maintained. But it was performance, not life. The staff noticed that Widener now ate alone more often than not. Eleanor rarely visited, finding the memories too painful. Joseph, the surviving son, preferred his own estate, spending his time with his horses. On November 6, 1915, Peter Widener died in his bed at Lynnewood Hall. His last words, according to his valet, "Turn me toward the window. I want to see the trees." The funeral was small, family and close friends only. The man who had hosted 800 at his housewarming was buried with just 50 mourners. The will was straightforward. Joseph inherited the estate and most of the fortune. Eleanor received the art collection with the understanding it would eventually go to a museum. Joseph Widener was a different man than his father. Where Peter loved art, Joseph loved horses. Where Peter built a palace, Joseph would have preferred a farm. He kept Lynnewood Hall running, but his heart wasn't in it. The great parties stopped. The public viewing of the art collection ended. The staff was reduced from 70 to 30. In 1920, Joseph made a decision that would have horrified his father. He began selling the art. Not all at once. A painting here, a tapestry there. The excuse was always reasonable. This piece didn't fit the collection. That one was doubtful attribution. But the pattern was clear. Lynnewood Hall was being emptied. The Mazarin tapestries went to the Metropolitan Museum, the Chinese porcelains to private collectors. One by one, the Rembrandts found new homes. Joseph claimed he was refining the collection, but in truth, he was dismantling it. The house itself began to show neglect. The third floor was closed off. The swimming pool was drained and never refilled. The greenhouses, which had employed 10 gardeners, were reduced to 2. The fountain that had welcomed visitors at the entrance was turned off to save on maintenance. But the most significant change came in 1940. Joseph Widener, perhaps seeing the war clouds gathering in Europe, perhaps simply tired of managing his father's monument, announced he was donating the remaining art collection to the National Gallery in Washington. Over 2,000 works of art. Paintings, sculptures, decorative objects. The gift was so large that the National Gallery had to build a new wing to house it. The tax deduction was enormous, but that wasn't the point. Joseph was freeing himself from his father's obsession. The art left Lynnewood Hall in a convoy of armoured trucks on June 15, 1942. Each painting was wrapped in silk, crated in custom boxes, driven slowly to Washington under police escort. The Rembrandt that Peter Widener had contemplated for hours in his study would now hang where millions could see it. But here's what the donation meant for Lynnewood Hall. Without the art, it was just an enormous empty house. 110 rooms with nothing to display. Joseph Widener died on October 26, 1943. Not at Lynnewood Hall, but at Hialeah Park, his racetrack in Florida. He was buried in the family mausoleum, the last Widener to be. His children, Peter, Fitz, and Josephine, had no interest in Lynnewood Hall. They had their own lives, their own houses. The estate was put on the market in 1944. Asking price, $1 million. There were no buyers. Think about that. A house built for $8 million, containing materials worth more than that in marble and gold leaf alone, couldn't find a buyer at any price. The problem was obvious. Who needed 110 rooms in 1944? The age of grand estates was over. Income taxes made them impossible to maintain. Servant labour was scarce and expensive. The world that had created Lynnewood Hall no longer existed. In 1948, the estate was subdivided. The 300 acres became a development called Lynnewood Park, modest homes for returning veterans. The mansion itself, with its remaining 33 acres, continued to search for purpose. Finally, in 1952, a buyer emerged. Carl McIntyre, a fundamentalist minister who wanted to turn Lynnewood Hall into a seminary. The purchase price was $192,000, less than the original construction cost of just the ballroom. The day before the sale closed, a photographer was allowed to document the empty house. His images show vast rooms with nothing but shadows. The ballroom where 600 had danced, empty except for the 3 baccarat chandeliers. The art gallery, its silk wall coverings stained with rectangles where paintings had hung. The indoor pool, dry and cracking. In one photograph, a single chair sits in the middle of the entrance hall. Someone, perhaps a caretaker, perhaps one of the Widener children come to say goodbye, had placed it there to rest while contemplating what had been and what would never be again. For 40 years, Lynnewood Hall served as the Faith Theological Seminary. Students attended lectures in the ballroom. The art gallery became a cafeteria. Dormitory rooms were carved from the grand bedroom suites. The indoor pool was used for baptisms. It was undignified, but at least the building had purpose, had life, had people moving through its rooms. Karl McIntyre was a controversial figure, a fundamentalist who preached against communism, civil rights, and the Catholic Church. His seminary was never fully accredited. Enrollment peaked at 200 students in the 1960s, declined to fewer than 50 by the 1980s. Maintenance was deferred. The roof developed leaks. The heating system, designed for a full staff to manage, broke down repeatedly. The elaborate garden designs of Jacques Kléber were abandoned to grow wild. By 1990, the seminary was failing. McIntyre, now in his 80s, could no longer raise the funds to operate. The last students left in 1992. The last caretaker was dismissed in 1996. Lynnewood Hall was abandoned. Nature works fast on an abandoned building. Within a year, vines had covered the lower windows. Within 5 years, trees were growing through the greenhouse roofs. Water, entering through 1,000 small failures in the roof, began its patient work of destruction. The first urban explorers found Lynnewood Hall around 2003. They came respectfully, photographers and historians documenting decay. Their images show a building caught between grandeur and ruin. Painted ceilings peeling like sunburned skin. Marble staircases covered in moss. The indoor pool filled with 4 feet of stagnant water. But word spread. Forums dedicated to abandoned places shared the location. By 2010, Lynnewood Hall had become a destination. YouTube changed everything. Suddenly, breaking into Lynnewood Hall wasn't just trespassing, it was content. Exploring America's largest abandoned mansion, ghost hunting in the Titanic house, 24 hours in a haunted palace. Each video brought more visitors. Each visitor did a little more damage. Instagram launched in October 2010. By 2011, #Lynnewood Hall was trending. The damage accelerated exponentially. It wasn't just explorers anymore, it was anyone with a smartphone wanting the perfect shot. They came by the dozens, then hundreds. Weekends saw groups of 20 or 30 breaking in simultaneously. They took souvenirs, doorknobs, tiles, pieces of carved wood. Someone removed an entire marble fireplace mantel. Light fixtures appeared on eBay. Authentic piece from Titanic mansion, the listings read. But the real damage was from the documentation itself. Every broken window was an entry point for rain. Every forced door broke the barrier between inside and outside. Every footstep through the rotting floors weakened the structure further. The township tried to secure the building. They boarded windows. The boards were torn off within days. They hired security, too expensive to maintain. They installed cameras. They were stolen. Between 2015 and 2020, there were over 200 arrests for trespassing. It made no difference. The Internet had decided Lynnewood Hall belonged to it. In 2019, a structural engineer assessed the building for potential buyers. His report was devastating. The roof was beyond repair. It would need complete replacement. The floors were rotting. Many were unsafe to walk on. Mold had colonized the walls so thoroughly that remediation would require stripping the building to its steel skeleton. The cost to restore Lynnewood Hall to habitable condition, $100 million minimum. But here's the tragedy. Much of this damage happened in just the last decade. If the building had been properly mothballed in 1996, roof repaired, windows sealed, climate control maintained, it could have survived another century waiting for rescue. Instead, our age of instant documentation, of turning everything into content, had accomplished what time alone couldn't: the complete destruction of an architectural masterpiece. The Titanic sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Lynnewood Hall has been sinking for 20 years, and we've filmed every moment of it. Today, in 2024, Lynnewood Hall waits. In 2023, the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation finally acquired the property after years of legal battles and fundraising. They paid $9 million for a building that cost $8 million to build in 1897. Inflation has made even catastrophe expensive. The foundation's plan is ambitious: stabilize the structure, restore the exterior, eventually open it as a museum and educational center. They've raised $6 million so far. They need $100 million more. The first phase, emergency stabilization, is underway. New temporary roofing to stop further water damage, security fencing to keep out trespassers, structural supports where floors have failed. It's triage, not restoration. Walking through Lynnewood Hall today requires a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and a strong constitution. The smell hits you first: mold, rot, decay. The grand staircase is still there, but you can see through the steps to the basement below. The ballroom ceiling has partially collapsed, its gold leaf scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. The indoor pool is a hazard zone, its tilework beautiful but deadly, ready to collapse at any weight. But traces of grandeur remain. A carved marble fireplace too heavy to steal. The outline of the Tiffany skylight, its glass long gone, but its bronze framework intact. In what was once Peter Widener's study, the silk wall covering has rotted away except for one small section, protected by a built-in bookshelf, showing the original deep crimson, unfaded after 125 years. What does Lynnewood Hall teach us? First, that American wealth has always been precarious. The Wideners went from butcher shop to palace in 1 generation, from palace to ruin in 3. The fortune that built Lynnewood Hall, streetcars, steel, tobacco, evaporated as industries changed, taxes rose, and dynasties failed to produce heirs who shared their ancestors' ambitions. Second, that we are terrible custodians of our own history. Europe preserves palaces from the 1400s. We let a palace from 1900 rot. The difference isn't age, it's attitude. Europeans see historic buildings as cultural patrimony. Americans see them as real estate problems. But the deeper lesson is about the democratization of destruction. For most of history, buildings were destroyed by war, fire, or time. Lynnewood Hall is being destroyed by documentation. Every person who breaks in to take a selfie, every YouTuber who films another exploration, every Instagram post tagged #abandonedplaces is participating in a new kind of vandalism. Not malicious, but cumulative. Not intended, but inevitable. We've turned ruins into content, decay into entertainment. We've gamified trespassing, monetized deterioration, made abandonment aspirational. Lynnewood Hall isn't just abandoned, it's performed abandonment, curated decay, orchestrated ruin. Think about what that means. A building that survived the Depression, 2 world wars, decades of deferred maintenance, is being killed by smartphones. Peter Widener built Lynnewood Hall to last 500 years. Social media will finish it off in 20. The Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation believes the building can be saved. They point to success stories: Nemours in Delaware, Whitemarsh Hall stables that were preserved when the main house was demolished, even Versailles itself, which was nearly destroyed after the French Revolution but was saved by Napoleon. The plan is to restore Lynnewood Hall not as a single-family home — that dream died with the Gilded Age — but as a living museum, a place where craftspeople can learn traditional building techniques, where students can study Beaux-Arts architecture, where the public can understand how America's industrial fortunes were built and lost. It's a beautiful vision. It's also enormously expensive. $100 million just to make the building safe. Another $100 million to restore it to something approaching its original grandeur. And then millions more every year to maintain it. The critics say it's too late. The building is too damaged, the cost too high, the public interest too limited. Better to document what remains and let it go. America is full of abandoned buildings. We can't save them all. But Lynnewood Hall isn't just any building. It's the last surviving example of Horace Trumbauer's residential work at this scale. It's a document of American ambition at its peak. It's a witness to the Titanic disaster, the Gilded Age's end, the transformation of American wealth from industrial to financial. More than that, it's a test. Can we value anything that doesn't generate immediate profit? Can we preserve something just because it's beautiful, historically significant, irreplaceable? Can we stop consuming ruins long enough to prevent them? Last month, I stood in what was once the entrance hall of Lynnewood Hall. The foundation had allowed me a brief visit to see the stabilization work. The marble floor was covered in plastic sheeting. The walls were supported by steel posts. It looked like a patient in intensive care, tubes and machines keeping something alive that wanted to die. But then the afternoon sun broke through the clouds and streamed through the empty windows. For just a moment the limestone glowed the way it must have on that December night in 1899, when 600 guests arrived for the opening gala. You could almost hear the orchestra, the laughter, the rustle of silk gowns on marble stairs. That's when I understood. Lynnewood Hall isn't just a building, it's a choice. Every abandoned mansion, every forgotten monument, every piece of history we let crumble is a choice. We're choosing the world we leave behind. Peter Widener built Lynnewood Hall to outlast centuries, to rival European palaces that have stood for 500 years. It lasted barely 50 years as a home before we began tearing it apart for parts. Perhaps that's the most American thing about it. Not the ambition that built it, but the indifference that's destroying it. The estate waits, patient in its decay, for a decision that may never come. In the meantime, the rain falls through the ballroom ceiling, drop by drop, washing away the gold leaf, the memories, and the last traces of an America that believed its monuments would last forever. Every broken window is a choice. Every stolen mantle, a decision. Every Instagram post from inside, a small participation in the destruction of something irreplaceable. The question isn't whether Lynnewood Hall can be saved. The question is whether we want to save it. Thank you for watching.